During my childhood, I resided in a humble two-story house with my parents and my older sister, Grace. I was raised in a tiny town. Despite the fact that we were just 2 years apart in age, there were times when it seemed as though we were living in entirely separate universes. Although my mother stayed at home and occasionally assisted at the restaurant, my father maintained a small cafe that brought in enough money to ensure that we were able to maintain our standard of living. We did not live a lavish lifestyle, but we were able to make ends meet. Okay, the majority of us did. Grace, sweetheart, that presentation was absolutely brilliant. One evening, after a school event, I overheard my mother gushing over something. "You're going to go so far in life. You're just so talented." Even though I was still carrying my own certificate from the scientific fair, nobody appeared to notice that I was standing in the doorway the entire time. The situation was always the same. I was the shadow of Grace, and she was the star of the show. That was the pattern that my upbringing followed. While Grace was able to acquire the most recent iPhone, I was able to inherit her older model with a damaged screen. Unlike me, she wore fancy clothes, while I wore clothes that she had given to me. At each and every family get-together, Grace's accomplishments were brought to the forefront. What are your thoughts on Grace's performance on this aid? Our father would inform our relatives with great pride. Exceptional percentile. In addition to that, she is the president of the debate club. During these chats, I learned to blend in with the background, knowing that my perfect grades and my position as treasurer of the environmental club would not be worthy of being mentioned. It was not that I was doing terribly, rather, I was doing absolutely wonderful. However, in our household, the terms fine and failure are interchangeable. When I was helping my mother fold laundry, she once told me, "Stella, you really ought to give some serious consideration to the various career options that are available to you. Something in the service or retail sector, perhaps. There is absolutely nothing wrong with working honestly." Although the remarks were painful, I had been accustomed to the regular reminders of the restrictions that I believed I had. The manner in which they appeared to be actively working to reinforce them was something that I had not become accustomed to. When I look back on those early years, I understand that they laid the foundation for all that would come after them. The continual comparisons, the subtle put-downs, and the plain message that I was somehow less than my sister were all things that I endured during those years. It would take years for the wounds that were left behind to heal. However, there are instances when the most severe wounds become the most powerful inspirations. And my family had no idea that the way they were treated would eventually come back to define all of our careers and our lives. I can still vividly recall the day when Grace received the letter of admittance to college. Everyone in the house burst out in joyous jubilation. They spent the entire evening discussing her future plans as Mom prepared her favorite supper. Dad bought home an expensive bottle of wine, and they spent the entire evening together. Our brilliant girl is going to attend one of the most prestigious colleges in the city. The mother couldn't contain her joy. "Sweetheart, ever since you were born, we have been putting money aside for this very moment." Although I was sitting calmly at the dinner table, I was attempting to anticipate what my own celebration will be like in 2 years. I was pushing food around my plate. Perhaps I ought to have known better. As soon as it was my turn, the answer was completely different from what I had anticipated. In order to strengthen my college applications, I had put in a lot of effort to keep my grades up. I had joined clubs, and I had even taken some additional classes. But it seems that none of that was relevant. "Is it college?" The tone of my mother's chuckle was abrupt and dismissive when I brought up the topic. "Stella, do not ignore reality. Sadly, we are unable to send you at this time. To add insult to injury, you are not truly a college student." However, what about all of the money that you have in reserve for Grace? I inquired, having a trembling voice. The father cleared his throat in an awkward manner, but that was not the same. Grace was on the right track, and that was to achieve great marks. You're in a better position to work in practical settings. While we are on the subject of that, I could really use another waitress at the cafe. I was having a hard time believing what I was hearing. I pleaded with myself I could work while I was studying. Would you kindly assist me in getting started? Alternately, we may borrow money from our relatives or get a loan. I will repay every money along with interest, and I will even get it written down with the assistance of a lawyer. When it comes to principal, we never borrow money from anyone. It was Mom who said it. We do not take out loans, and we are not going to alter our business practices in order to accommodate you. You have to acknowledge your limitations and look for a profession that is acceptable for you. I cried silently in my chamber throughout the night, but by the time morning arrived, my tears had been replaced by determination. My grandparents were the only people who had ever seen me in a genuine way, so I went to see them. I was crying as I told everything to my grandparents at their kitchen table. "Grandpa, Grandma, I need your help," I began. "I merely cannot give up on going to college. Not at all." The look in Grandpa's eyes conveyed a range of emotions, including wrath and despair. "Sweetheart, we do not have any savings, but let me see what if I can do something about it. It is not possible for any of my grandchildren to have their hopes and dreams dashed in such a manner." After the initial disappointment of the bank's decision to reject the loan application, the subsequent few weeks were filled with a roller coaster of emotions. First, there was the shocking moment when Grandpa informed that he was selling their old country house together with a parcel of land that it was situated on. Exactly enough money was made from the sale of the land to cover the cost of my college education. I applied to study investment management in a city far from home, as far as I could get from the constant reminders of my family's lack of faith in me. The day I left, Mom and Dad didn't even come to say goodbye. Only my grandparents stood at the bus station, Grandma hugging me tight while Grandpa wiped away what he tried to pretend weren't tears. From that day forward, I cut ties with my parents completely. When breaks came and I had to return to town, I stayed with my grandparents in their now smaller house. Their sacrifice meant everything to me, and every time I walked into their modest home, I was reminded of what real family support looked like. After 4 years of hard work, I finally graduated with my degree in investment management. I returned to my hometown with big dreams and a freshly printed diploma, but reality hit hard. The job market wasn't exactly welcoming to new graduates, and I spent weeks sending out applications without any promising responses. Eventually, I landed a position at a small trading company. It wasn't the prestigious investment firm I'd imagined working for, but it was a start. I found a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, paid for with my own money. Then came the call I never expected. Stella, Grace's voice was sugar-sweet on the phone. "It's been ages. You should come over for dinner this weekend. I'd love to catch up." Something in her tone should have warned me, but I agreed. Maybe time had changed things. Maybe we could finally have a real relationship as adults. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived at Grace's house that evening, I immediately knew I'd walked into a trap. My parents were already there, along with Grace's boyfriend, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who barely acknowledged my existence. The interrogation began as soon as we sat down to eat. "So Stella," Mom started, her fork poised midair. "Tell us about this job of yours." "I'm working at a trading company," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's small, but—" Grace cut in with a laugh. "Trading company? You mean like those discount stores? Honestly, you didn't need a college degree for that. Anyone could walk in off the street and get that job. Unlike Grace, Mom beamed. She's a manager at the city bank. And Thomas here, she added, gesturing to Grace's boyfriend, is a lawyer with Anderson and Pierce. Grace's boyfriend nodded smugly. Top law firm in the state. I told you college wasn't necessary for you, dear. Mom sighed, such a waste of your grandfather's property. Dad chuckled, swirling his wine glass. Hey, my offer still stands. I could use an educated waitress at the cafe. Think how impressed the customers would be. Would you like fries with that? From someone with a college degree. They all laughed except me. I stared at my plate, pushing the food around, just like I used to do as a child. Where did you say you're living now? Grace asked, though I hadn't mentioned it yet. I found a place on Cedar Street, I replied quietly. The table erupted in theatrical gasps. Cedar Street? Grace's eyes widened in mock concern. Oh, Stella, that's literally the worst neighborhood in the city. Only she paused for effect. Well, you know, people who can't afford better live there. Beggars, she means. Beggars, Mom stage whispered, and they all laughed again. Something inside me snapped. 4 years of distance hadn't changed anything. They were still the same cruel, judgmental people they'd always been. I stood up so abruptly my chair scraped loudly against the floor. You know what? I'd rather be a beggar than be like any of you. I spat out. At least I got where I am on my own, without riding on someone else's coattails or living off Daddy's money. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, ignoring their protests and accusations. As I walked out into the night, I promised myself it would be the last time I ever set foot in their presence. Life has a funny way of surprising you, just when you think you've hit a dead end. I was still working at the small trading company, doing my best but feeling stuck, when my phone rang one afternoon. It was Lisa, my old college roommate. Stella, you're not going to believe this. She was practically shouting with excitement. Remember how we always talked about working for Maxwell Investment Group? They're opening an office in your city, and they're looking for fresh talent. I already put in a good word for you. My heart started racing. Maxwell was one of the biggest names in investment management. I spent that night updating my resume and the next week preparing for the interview. When I walked into their temporary office, I felt like everything in my life had been leading to this moment. The interview wasn't easy. They grilled me on everything from market trends to specific investment strategies. But all those extra hours I'd put in at my current job, all the additional research I'd done in my free time, it all paid off. A week later, I got the call. I was in. From day one, I threw myself into the work. While others went home at 5, I stayed late, developing new investment strategies and refining my project proposals. My first major project was managing a portfolio for a mid-sized tech company. When it yielded a 40% return in the first quarter, people started noticing. Stella, this is exceptional work, my supervisor said during my 6-month review. Along with his praise came a bonus that was larger than my entire year's salary at the previous company. But it wasn't enough. I worked harder, took on bigger projects, and built a reputation for turning struggling investments into gold mines. The bonuses kept getting bigger, and I had a plan for every penny. 2 years after starting at Maxwell, I walked into a luxury car dealership. The salesman probably thought I was lost until I pointed to their top-of-the-line model and said, "I'll take that one." An hour later, I was pulling up to my grandparents' house in a gleaming new car, complete with a giant red bow on top. Grandpa's jaw dropped when I handed him the keys, but I wasn't done. The next month, I closed on a stunning apartment in the Heights, the most prestigious new development in the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and a view that made you feel like you owned the whole city. One morning, as I walked out of my building, coffee in hand, I heard a familiar voice. Stella. Grace stood there in her designer workout gear, looking like she'd seen a ghost. What are you doing here? I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. Oh, I live here, I said casually, pointing to the penthouse level of the building. Just bought it, actually. The look on Grace's face was priceless, a mixture of disbelief, shock, and something else. For the first time in our lives, I saw envy in my perfect sister's eyes. A week after my encounter with Grace, my phone rang. Seeing my parents' number on the screen was surprising enough. They hadn't called me in years. Even more surprising was that they were in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. When they walked into my apartment, their expressions were priceless. Mom's eyes darted from the panoramic windows to the designer furniture, while Dad stood awkwardly in the entrance, as if afraid to touch anything. This is quite impressive, Mom managed, running her finger along my marble kitchen counter. You must be doing very well for yourself. I am, I replied simply, offering them seats on my Italian leather sofa. They exchanged glances before Mom cleared her throat. Well, we actually have some news. Grace is engaged to Thomas. They announced it last month at the engagement party. An engagement party I hadn't been invited to. Of course, they're planning the wedding for 6 months from now. Mom continued, her voice taking on that familiar wheedling tone I remembered from childhood. We've offered to pay half the expenses, as is traditional. Dad shifted uncomfortably, but it seems the total budget is, well, it's $300,000. I nearly choked on my water. $300,000. Thomas's family has certain expectations, Mom explained quickly. They're very prominent in the community. We announced we'd cover half before we knew the amount, and now, she trailed off, looking at me meaningfully. Now you need $150,000, I finished for her. Exactly, Mom brightened. And since you're doing so well, living in this beautiful apartment, working at such a prestigious firm. You want me to give you the money, I said flatly. Loan, Dad interjected. We're asking for a loan. We'll pay you back, of course. We'll even get it notarized. We know it's a lot, Mom said quickly, but we can't back out now. It would be so embarrassing with Thomas's family. They're expecting a certain standard. Like when I wanted to go to college. I interrupted. When I begged you for help. When I offered to sign a legal document promising to pay you back. Mom's face flushed. That was different. Different how? Because it was me asking. Because you told me you don't borrow money on principle. Stella, be reasonable, Dad started. Reasonable? I stood up. Like you were reasonable when you told me I wasn't college material. When you offered me a waitress job instead of helping me get an education. When you let Grandpa sell his property to help me, while you saved all your money for Grace. That's not fair, Mom protested. No, what's not fair is that you're only here because you need something from me. You didn't invite me to the engagement party. You haven't spoken to me in years. And now you want $150,000. I walked to the door and opened it. I don't loan money on principle. I believe that's a family tradition, isn't it? Mom's face turned red with anger. How dare you throw our words back at us after everything we've done for you? Everything you've done for me. I laughed bitterly. Please leave. They stormed out, Mom muttering about ingratitude, and Dad avoiding eye contact. As I closed the door behind them, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up to them on my own terms in my own home. I sat back in my office chair, watching the sunset through my panoramic windows. Selfish? That's rich coming from you, Grace. We're family, Stella. Family helps each other. You have the money. Everyone knows you're doing well now. Why won't you help with my wedding? I could almost laugh at the absurdity. Family? Now suddenly I'm family? What about when I was visiting your house, and you all called me a beggar? When you mocked where I lived? When you laughed at my job? Was I family then? That was different, Grace protested. We were just teasing. You're being ridiculous now. No, what's ridiculous is that none of you spoke to me for years, until you needed something. If you need money so badly, why don't you ask our parents? They're your real family after all. They made that clear enough over the years. You bitter, ungrateful. Grace exploded. You think you're so much better than us now with your fancy apartment and your big job. You're still the same pathetic little sister who was never good enough. The line went dead as she hung up. I sat there for a moment, surprised to find that her words didn't hurt anymore. They just made me tired. A week later, I was having Sunday dinner at my grandparents' house, a tradition I'd kept up ever since college. Grandma was unusually quiet as she served the pot roast. Your parents called us yesterday, Grandpa finally said, his voice heavy. I put down my fork. Let me guess. They asked for money for the wedding? Grandma nodded. They're getting desperate. I think your mother had quite a lot to say about family obligations when we told them we're retired and don't have that kind of money, Grandpa continued. Your mother had the nerve to suggest we sell something, he added. She said, well, you sold the land for Stella's college, didn't you? She even suggested we sell the car I gave you. I was stunned. She actually suggested you sell your gift. That's when I hung up on her, Grandpa said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. I told her that, unlike some people, we don't sell gifts from family members who actually care about us. Grandma reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The three of us sat there in understanding silence, bound together by something stronger than mere blood ties. Word travels fast in a small town, and my parents made sure it traveled even faster. Within weeks, their version of events had spread through our entire extended family and social circle. I started hearing snippets of their carefully crafted narrative from various sources. Did you hear about the younger daughter? My mother's friend loudly gossiped at the local grocery store, not realizing I was in the next aisle. Got some fancy job, and now she thinks she's too good for her own family. Won't even speak to them anymore. Says they're too poor for her now. At church, relatives would shoot disapproving glances my way when I visited with my grandparents. My Aunt Martha called one evening heavy with judgment. Your mother told me you wouldn't even let her into your apartment when she came to visit. How could you treat your own mother that way? I could have corrected the record, could have told everyone how my parents had only reached out when they needed money, how they'd never supported my dreams, how they'd mocked and belittled me at every turn. But I'd learned long ago that trying to defend yourself against toxic people only gives them more ammunition. Instead, I focused on my work, spent time with my grandparents, and let the gossip swirl around me like autumn leaves in the wind. My grandparents knew the truth. They'd lived through every moment of it with me, and that was enough. With 2 weeks left before the wedding, Grace made one final attempt. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, wearing her most expensive outfit and her most convincing smile. Stella, we need to talk, she said, brushing past me into the living room. This has gone on long enough. We're sisters. We shouldn't be fighting like this. I stood by the window, arms crossed, watching her settle herself on my sofa as if she owned it. Why are you really here, Grace? To make peace, she said, giving me her best pageant winner smile, and to help you understand the situation better. You see, Thomas's parents are not just rich, they're old money. They have connections everywhere. The wedding has to be perfect. I waited, knowing there was more. The final payments are due next week. The restaurant deposit, the wedding planner fee, the flowers. She twisted her engagement ring nervously. If Mom and Dad can't contribute their share, it's going to be so embarrassing. Thomas's parents will find out they couldn't afford it. It won't just reflect badly on Mom and Dad. It'll reflect on me, on my future with Thomas. So this visit isn't really about reconciling. It's about the money. No, well, yes, she admitted, standing up and walking over to me. Placing her hand on my arm, she said, "Stella, please. You're my sister. I need your help. We need to make a great impression on Thomas's parents." I gently removed her hand, walked to the door, and opened it. I don't care about impressing Thomas's parents. I don't care about your perfect wedding. And I definitely don't care what any of you think anymore. You're making a huge mistake, she said, her voice trembling with anger. You'll regret this. I smiled, feeling genuinely at peace. No, Grace. For the first time in my life, I'm absolutely certain I won't. A few days after Grace's visit, my phone lit up with a text from Sarah, her college friend who'd always been kind to me. She thought I should know what had happened at the country club the previous evening. Your parents finally had to come clean to Thomas's family, she wrote. They couldn't dodge the wedding planner calls anymore. It was apparently quite a scene. I could picture it clearly. The elegant country club dining room, Thomas's wealthy parents in their designer clothes, the moment my parents had to admit they couldn't afford their share of the wedding expenses. According to Sarah, Thomas's mother had practically turned purple with rage. The carefully planned fairy tale wedding began to unravel. The honeymoon suite in the Maldives canceled. The vintage champagne order scaled back. The designer flower arrangements simplified. Thomas's parents eventually agreed to cover all the expenses themselves, but the damage was done. The wedding did go forward, though scaled down from its original grandeur. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't expect to be. My grandparents received an invitation but declined to attend, sending a polite note about prior commitments. Instead, we chose to spend that Saturday together, enjoying a picnic in their backyard, and we made it a point to avoid any mention of the event that was going place in the opposite direction of town. Photos from the wedding were uploaded to social media 1 week after the event. During one evening, I found myself scrolling through them with a glass of wine in my hand, analyzing the features that were captured in each meticulously posed photograph. Grace appeared in the designer gown she had chosen. In the presence of his family, who were arrayed about him like priceless statues, Thomas appeared stiff and formal. In addition, my parents were easy to detect since they were wearing brand new clothes, which they had most likely purchased on credit. They were making a concerted effort to appear as though they belonged in this world of old money and country club memberships. On the other hand, their smiles were forced, and their poses were awkward. On the other hand, Thomas's parents were only seen in a handful of photographs, and their facial expressions ranged from barely hidden scorn to obvious disgust. In a particularly illuminating photograph, his mother was seen looking at my parents with a kind of expression that is typically designated for something nasty that is discovered on the bottom of one's shoe. During the weeks that followed, Sarah would periodically send me updates via text message. Following their wedding, Grace and Thomas moved into a house that had been purchased by Thomas's parents as a gift. There were just a few occasions when my parents came to visit. It seems that they were not exactly what Thomas's family had envisioned for Sunday dinners. Since the time before the wedding, I have not communicated with either my parents or Grace. It is quite unlikely that I will ever do so again. Nevertheless, as I sit here in my apartment and watch the sunset, painting the sky of the city in all shades of gold, I am finally at peace with the reality of the situation. After being torched, certain bridges ought to remain in ashes.